How is that level of sensitivity, though, assessed?
Well, you do have to take into account that sensitivity, but if you look at the language of the president and this administration, they're speaking about a war. And the founding fathers 250 years ago were very intentional about putting that power in Congress and ensuring that the money that would be allocated for wars would come from Congress. And so that's why you're seeing bipartisan efforts both in the House as well as in the Senate by Thomas Massie and Ro Khanna, as well as Tim Kaine and Rand Paul to advance this war powers resolution. And I think regardless of whether or not it passes, it's a very important conversation for our country to have to ensure that we have constitutional wars in this country, especially when you talk about the decision to taking largely working class kids into harm's way, financing these wars on the backs of our kids in terms of the deficit spending that's required to fund these wars. That is a sacred decision and it's a constitutional one, and it needs to go through Congress.
So, as Hannah Brandt reported earlier in the program, the chances of this actually changing the trajectory of this mission with the vote on the War Powers Act, that appears to be slim. This is more about getting politicians on the record on this issue, especially ahead of the midterms. Would you agree with that strategy play?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's important that in a moment, an inflection point like this, that you have the 535 members of the House and Senate who put their name down for the record for us to know where they stand on this issue. And I think that then becomes an important conversation when these members of Congress go to their home districts. They go to high school gymnasiums, they're going to Rotary clubs, they're going to community centers, and they have to be held accountable by their voters and hear from their voters. That's why the system was constructed in this way. And I do think at least getting members of Congress on the record is very important right now.
And on the flip side of this, there is a line of thinking that if this resolution fails decisively, it only strengthens the president's political position to continue this mission. Do you see that as a potential pitfall, a political risk here?
You could see it as a risk. I mean, in any situation, politically or militarily, the president will declare victory. So it's not so much about that. It's more about these members of Congress who, especially in swing districts, are going to have to answer for these decisions, answer for these votes. And I think regardless of how the vote turns out, I just think this is such a sacred decision that needs to be put on the record.
And prior to this strike, you had the vice president and the Washington Post being quoted as saying this: the idea that we're going to be in a Middle Eastern war for years with no end in sight, there's no chance that will happen. Now we have this apparent goal of regime change, and the president stating just moments ago, essentially, that this will continue, this military action will continue as long as necessary. Does he run the risk of drawing this out into an uncomfortable timeline for the administration to justify?
Exactly. I think that's the big question right now. There's so many unknowns right now, and one of the big unknowns is the timeline of military action and the timeline of instability in the region. And I think when you think about the midterms and the vote in Congress potentially that might happen on this, the MAGA base and Republicans are going to have a big challenge because MAGA did not sign up for this explicitly. MAGA signed up for ending endless wars, ending regime change wars, and America first. You see figures like Marjorie Taylor Greene speaking to this position. And so if this goes on for a long period of time, I do think you'll see a significant fissure in the MAGA base. You see figures like Tucker Carlson, for example, expressing his discontent with this military action. So if it's done quickly, almost as quickly as what happened in Venezuela, even though that was a very different situation, I think the MAGA base supports him. But if it goes on for a long time, you'll see a big divide.
Yeah, the timeline has major implications in all of this. Steven Olikara, always great to get your take. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Kelly.